So we get a lot of inquiries, and I was with a colleague yesterday who works in the same industry, works with us, who also gets inquiries on a daily basis of this manner, which are one-liners which say, I've got this vehicle, how much is it going to cost me to register in Spain? We have to go back to them and ask for a series of information, copies of paperwork, etc., to try and work that quote out. And people don't understand what we're asking for. What we're asking for, a lot of people just don't bother. And I thought it'd be a good idea in a video. I was talking, so how can we explain it? I said, look, I'm just going to do a video and explain the intricacies of putting a quote together to register a vehicle in Spain. Right, and why it's just not easy to put a blanket quote when someone says, I've got this vehicle, how much is it? Okay, so as we know, I've spoken a lot about registering vehicles on this channel, but this video is going to be focused on putting the quote together to register somebody's car. So as we know, we break down the process of registering a vehicle into technical, tax and traffic code. Tax and technical, there's a lot of crossover when doing the quote. I'm going to explain why. To start with, I'm going to promote tax to the first thing we talk about. And the reason that we need to know more detail surrounding a person's circumstance is because it really affects the tax. Okay, so first of all, for vehicles which are coming from the UK or another country from outside the EU, they will need a DUA document. Or, only a DUA document. But how do you get a DUA document? Well, there's two ways of getting a DUA document. You can get a DUA document by either paying the VAT and duty of the import or waivering the import and VAT and the duty. Okay, so you can either pay it or waiver it. And that heavily depends on your circumstance. So we get a lot of these now come through the UK for people who are changing residence. So if you're changing residence and you're coming to Spain and you've done everything properly, you've got your visa in place, you've got your padron in place, and you've done all the paperwork in line, you have to also have signed off the tax office or informed the tax office in the UK that you've left there. And this also happens with other third countries as well. The import agents are going to want to see proof of where you've been, what you've been doing, where you've come to, and how you've registered. All right. In those circumstances, if you've got your own personal vehicle, well, then you're going to be able to bring it in tax-free. Most people pay an import agent a couple €100 to do that process for them. You can do it yourself. But that evidently heavily affects the quote to register a vehicle, because if you don't have everything in place, then you're going to have to pay the tax and VAT on the import. What we've seen a lot of is people who have recently taken residency but signed on the padron maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, all right, and the tax office will do anything to not waive the tax. So as far as they're concerned, there's a lot of people who were wrongly told, or own properties here, wrongly told to get on the padron. Got a padron certificate, didn't live here, they're encouraged to do so. I've seen town halls, I'm not going to name any of them, who are encouraging non-residents to do so, like Marbella, but it's not the right thing to do, and now that's coming out in the wash. For non-residents who signed on the padron, they're coming over here, they're doing everything correctly, they're advised to sign on, and suddenly the tax office turns around and says, now, you were here then. And they're like, well, no, we weren't. This is my residency card, but you're on the padron. Can't waive the tax. All right? So that's a good thing as well. If you are on the padron and you're non-resident, you intend to come get off the padron as soon as possible. Okay, sidetrack there a little bit. I do tend to waffle on. So that affects the import tax and duty. So this is immediately why we need to know people's personal circumstances, what their intentions are, if they're going to be a resident, if they're registering as resident, and if they've registered before on the padron, or they don't want to register at all and they're bringing it from outside the EU into Spain and need to pay the taxes. That's point one with the tax. Point two is the special registrations tax. Now, if you have to pay special registrations tax, then that is calculated on a massive 1,000-page document called a BOE. Now, the BOE is the official bulletin where all the laws and everything is published in Spain, and every year they update the base price for new vehicles manufactured and sold in Spain. Now, somebody calculating this tax has to find that specific vehicle on there. And sometimes you imagine like a Ford Focus, for example, there's like 1,000. And the way that we do that is using the documents from the vehicle, and we have to look at the first date of registration, the size of the engine, the power output, the emissions used to be a factor, but now the new BOEs do not include the emissions on there, so that's taken that power away from us to try and identify a vehicle with the emissions. That all relates back to the old Volkswagen scandal a few years ago. They then took the emissions off the boat. Okay, so if you just say Renault Megane 1.6, there's probably thousands, so we need to know more. Is it an expression? Is it that? And that's how you identify the model to give a calculation of the special registrations tax. Now, in some circumstances, this tax can be waived. It's extremely difficult, even for people who are changing residence, because it has to be done within a time frame. And normally, if you're getting a TIE card and a visa, you can never meet that time frame. Again, not the best on behalf of the tax office. For people who are on a European residency platform, they can normally meet that time scale. For people who aren't, they normally can't. So, and we have to explain that to people as well. So this is why, when calculating the taxes of a vehicle, it's very, very important to know what the personal circumstance of the person and their intentions are before even giving a quote for registering a vehicle. Aside from that, is where you're going to register it. The local town hall taxes vary completely. So if you're going to be going to Guadix in Granada or coming to Estepona, the tax is going to be different. All right, it's not a blanket tax. Now, what we normally do is we estimate the tax on a quarterly basis. So we say that the tax is going to be, if it's the full year, it's 200, 150 for 3 quarters, 100 for 2 quarters, and 50 if you register in the last quarter. Because when you register a vehicle, you only pay the quarter in which you register it. Now, a lot of vehicles only pay half of that in some municipalities, but it's it's an easy way to put it out there in a quote. And normally it's higher, so when someone comes to pay their final bill, the final bill is a bit lower. Okay, but when we come to register the tax itself, right at that front end, when giving a quote, we need to know the postcode and where we're registering it, because it's not a national registration. Sometimes you have to go to the town hall and register it. Sometimes it can be done on a digital certificate basis. Sometimes it has to be done, for example, with some town halls here, municipalities in Malaga, on the Patronato platform, because they are controlled by a central tax agency. Unless it's Alarin, Coin, Benamala. No, sorry, Coin is, Alarin del Grande isn't, Fuengirola isn't, Benamala isn't. So, it really depends. We need to know what work's going to be involved in registering that local tax. Okay, so that's the tax. That's why we need to know your personal circumstance before we can even give you a quote. Now let's move on to the technical. Now again, why do we need to know details of the vehicle, and why do we have to see the vehicle documentation? Right, because in a normal EU import situation, the vehicle must have on section K the EU homologation number, which must match up with the manufacturer's sticker. This has nothing to do with the VIN number. Evidently the VIN numbers all have to match up with the documents as well. But if you have, there's many countries like Poland and Ireland who always leave the K section blank. Well, here in Andalusia, where we are, if section K is blank, it doesn't matter if you present a ficha técnica reducida or a certificate of conformity, they will not register that vehicle in normal circumstances. Of the original documentation, now that has to be filled in with the correct EU homologation. Okay, what's the way around that? Well, we relate back to what we first spoke about, which was change of residence. If you can prove that you're changing your residence to Spain, this vehicle is actually yours, you've owned it for more than 6 months before you took residency, then you can pass it through an ITV test for change of residence, which weighs the need for that number to be on the document. But again, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this video, we need to know your personal circumstance when you registered as resident, see the documents, because we have to marry the two up and say, right, you took residency on this date, that's when they took ownership of the vehicle, okay, we can get it through for change of residence if the technical documentation isn't quite right. So, as you can see, doing the quote and understanding whether it can pass an ITV is quite difficult. Now we're going to get on to traffic code. Now, traffic code, comes back to tax as well. So sometimes, in some circumstances, we're going to need to get P plates for people whose vehicle has either been here too long, it's in a legal situation, and it depends on your personal situation as well. We might have to get provisional plates. They have their own requirements, okay, so that you have to have your proof of address. Now, provisional plates for a non-resident, the documents are completely different for provisional plates for a resident. At this point as well, we have to present the import document that is past the import agent if it comes through if it comes from a third country, so it's been through aduanas, which is called a DUA. And here, if the vehicle isn't owned by you or you bought it, so we've spoken a lot about change of residence imports or people who are being resident, how that can affect the taxes and the technical side of things. But say you already live in Spain and you've bought a vehicle in Germany and you want to bring it here to register it, or you'll say, I'm thinking about buying this vehicle, how much is it going to cost me? Well, the first thing we have to check is, are you going to get a valid invoice from the person who sells you that vehicle? Because if you don't, then you may be liable for change of ownership tax. All vehicles here, when they change ownership, have to pay a tax. Here it's the Model 621 to the local government, and there's no exception for matriculations. So if you're a resident and you've recently bought a vehicle from anywhere in the EU, for example, or even in the UK, it's not in your name, and you've got a valid invoice which includes an EU VAT number, etc., etc., the vehicle documentation has to be in the name of the company that sold it to you, not in the name of the individual that sold it to them. All right, so something else to check, which we have to check. So that's why it's impossible when someone says, I'm looking at buying this vehicle, how much is it going to cost? Well, first of all, we've got to check, are you going to get the right documentation? Whose name is the original documentation in at the moment? Because if not, there's no point putting the quote together unless we can see a valid invoice and that the documentation is in the name of the company who are going to sell you the vehicle. All right. Having a valid invoice and having the documents in the name of the company who are going to sell you the vehicle will allow you to waive the transfer of ownership tax, because they consider it as the tax has been paid within the EU. And if you're buying it off a private individual and you have a sales contract, which you're allowed to do, and the sales contract meets the name on the documentation, then more than likely, if you're a resident in Spain, you are going to be copped for the change of ownership tax. And as we know, change of ownership tax can be anything from thousands for a new vehicle to a few pence for an older one. And it's a completely different calculation to special registrations tax. So there you go. I just wanted to make this video to explain the intricacies of putting a quote together. We haven't even spoken about modifications to a vehicle. So someone will say, how much are the headlights for this? Well, nowadays we have, most of the time now, anything that's 2015 onwards, you have to send that person to the manufacturer, to their, if it's a Mercedes, go to Mercedes, because historically you could maybe manipulate the lights so they would work, but nowadays it needs to be done maybe on a computer, and if you did manipulate them, it would show up on the machine. Now the ITVs are now back into plugging in the diagnostic machine, and if there's anything that shows up on diagnostics which hasn't been cleared properly, or any modifications shown on the vehicle, then that is also a fail. So any vehicle with halogen headlights, which are the old style with the back reflectors, normally that's not a problem, you can source those. LEDs and xenons, normally you would have to go to the manufacturer to make sure as well that the faults are cleared, if there's any manipulation of the headlights. So yeah, that's the video. I just wanted to explain how difficult it is to put a quote together, and why when we get the one-liners that say, I've got Ford Fiesta, how much does it cost? We have to send a massive form asking all these questions, and if the form's not filled in, it's impossible for us to give an accurate quote on the import. Thanks for watching. Again, if this interests you, subscribe, somewhere over here and hit that bell thing, which means that every time we do a video you'll be informed.